this is, I think, a key insight. So if you're a dad who wants to make some change, this is important. So when you define yourself mainly by what you won't do, that makes growth, resilience, and emotional health harder to sustain over time if your identity is based on avoidance.
Welcome to the Dad Central Show, the podcast that helps overwhelmed dads conquer stress, build confidence, and become the father their family brags about. Join Drew Solon, a leadership coach and father of five, and Ed Gow Jr., a fatherhood advocate and contributor to the Good Men Project, as we guide you through the journey of fatherhood. We'll show you how to connect deeply with your family, manage your time and energy better, and master tools to become the dad you want to be. Let's get started. What is up, everybody? It is Ed Gow Jr. from the Dad Central Show and Dad Central. And before we go any further, want you to, wherever you are listening to this, subscribe. Whether you're listening or you're watching, subscribe. Very, very important, right out of the box. And what we're going to be talking about today, you are not your father, choosing a new identity this year. Drew, what do you think about this subject? Very intense conversation.
Yeah, way to kick off the new year with something deep and heavy. Well, it's an important conversation, especially if you're a dad who's listening and you want to make some changes. And these changes are sometimes deep. So, important conversation, Ed, for sure. We'll do the best we can in the short period that we're going to address it today. But this is the whole month of January. We're helping support dads break cycles and make meaningful, lasting change.
100%. So before we go any further, just want to say, when we're talking about or chatting about this conversation topic, we want to acknowledge the unspoken weight many dads carry. We also want to normalize the fear of repeating negative patterns. And also, we want to set the core truth. You are not your father. You are a decision maker. We're going to talk about a few different areas today. We're going to be talking about the problem, inherited patterns. We're also going to be chatting about the reframe, choosing a new identity. And then finally, we're going to be talking about practical application. So, Drew, let's kick it off with the first area, the inherited patterns. What do you have to say about that?
Well, let's start with just a quick summary statement that I think is really powerful. And so, awareness breaks cycles, but identity builds legacies. And I think this is where we're going to start with talking about these inherited patterns and creating some awareness from them. And we're going to ultimately, towards the end, show how you can rebuild based on a healthier, more powerful identity to help you begin to create a new legacy as opposed to what you've inherited. So, for me, if we're talking about inherited patterns, there's some real challenges that fathers face, and so I think many dads default, in particular, to this idea of reactive parenting. And found myself in that position early on in my fatherhood journey, and I had committed that that wasn't going to be me. But in these difficult moments, I found it became me at times, and so that was really hard. And it wasn't because I didn't care; it was because there are some main reasons: the models, the messages, and the pressures that I either grew up with or experienced as I became in my early fatherhood. And there's actually four reasons why this happens. So one is inherited role models. Many men are raised by fathers who focus on providing and discipline, not emotional presence. And so what you learn by experiencing that type of fatherhood is that problem solving is more important than connection. There's also cultural expectations. So this idea that traditional masculinity is often rewarding the idea of emotional suppression or decisiveness. And these stories or these narratives can lead us to want to make quick reactions instead of actual creating thoughtful guidance in our own fatherhood. There's also this challenge that we have what we'll call limited emotional reps, right? Without practice in emotional awareness or self-regulation, stress is often the trigger. And it triggers these things that are instinctive, these short-term responses that are either learned behavior or we just have, somehow assimilated from the previous two reasons I talked about. Finally, the reality is that as dads, we may have low bandwidth. Like work, finances, and life pressures really drain our emotional energy, and especially if we're not processing them in healthy ways. And so that what that does is it makes dads be in survival mode when we're parenting. And that's not great because our default, we default to what we've been kind of wired to when we're overwhelmed or stressed. And so the reality is that these inherited patterns are there. And these are some of the reasons why we might have those patterns.
Yeah, I think we can maybe spend a few quick moments talking about intentional parenting. Shifting from reaction to values, breaking old cycles, building awareness, and choosing actions that align with the father you want to be. So obviously, we have our past, 100%. But let's be honest, not everything in the past was right. And if fathers are blessed enough, have that conversation with your dad and find out, or your parents, there were some things you did when you raised me that I got a question. Where did you get those things from? I actually had that conversation with my dad a number of years ago about some things that he did. And he said, you know what? I didn't know any better. That was the way I was raised. That broke some emotional challenge from with me. So if you can, great. And sometimes, breaking those cycles, those people, they didn't know any better. So that was the only way they knew how to do things. So that is a little bit of a short story that I can share from my journey.
Yeah, I think it's important. I often said to myself, I'm not going to be like my dad, or I'm not going to. My goal was to not repeat some of the challenges, and so I was like, I'm going to do things differently. But often, you know, and other fathers may recognize this and say, I'm not going to do these things. And what really, when you're trying to define yourself by what you won't do, there's actually an issue there. And this is, I think, a key insight. So if your dad who wants to make some change, this is important. So when you define yourself mainly by what you won't do, you're building an identity around avoidance instead of purpose. And so what you're doing actually, that makes growth, resilience, and emotional health harder to sustain over time if your identity is based on avoidance. And so here are some key things that happen when you do that. One, you create an identity rigidity. So avoidance-based identities, they're brittle. They limit flexibility and make change feel like a threat rather than growth. You also reduce your resilience. So research shows that approach-oriented identities, like who I'm becoming, support better coping than avoidance oriented ones, which is something that you're rejecting, something you don't want to do. The other thing that happens is stalled growth. Focusing on not being like my dad or never doing X lacks a positive blueprint for skill building and development, which is really what's required when you're going to break cycles of inherited patterns. And finally, there's this idea of emotional strain. Avoidance focused self definitions are linked to higher stress. They're also linked to greater emotional suppression, which undermines our overall mental health. And so, dads, if you're listening, the most important thing, if you want to grow stronger, then you need to begin defining yourself by what you stand for, your values, your intention, and your actions, not by just what you're trying to escape. And for me, that was really crucial to learn in the process of making adjustments.
Stuff. Before we move on to our next conversation piece, I'll just leave with a question here. What did you learn about fatherhood without ever being taught? Just leave that thought process. So let's move on to our next conversation piece, the reframe, choosing a new identity. This is exciting. Making the choice to make a new identity. Drew, your thoughts?
Yeah, so this is where the work comes in, right? Ed talks about heart work, not hard work. And so we want to talk briefly about this idea of habits, because habits are how you're going to begin building that new identity, as well as shifting how you speak to yourself and how you think about yourself. And so I want to talk about most habits don't fail because you're lacking willpower to make these changes. They fail because this habit that you're wanting to do isn't aligned with how you see yourself. And this is grounded in research that in behavioral psychology and identity theory that shows that when identity that the reality is that your identity ultimately drives your behavior in ways that confirm who you believe you are, especially under stress. So as an example, you as a dad might try to wake up earlier. You might try to stop yelling. Maybe you want to be more present, or you want to put your phone down at night. But the reality is if your internal identity is still, I'm just an exhausted provider doing my best, or I'm not a naturally patient dad, what's going on is your brain's going to default back to old patterns the moment that pressure hits. And so, some research, as well as real life, show a couple of things. One, habits without identity, they're fragile. So, when a habit's just a rule, like you should stop yelling, stress breaks it. Identity based habits are replace it by saying, I'm a calm, steady dad. And that's creating you much more resilience in you if you shift your approach. The brain also protects identity first. So neuroscience shows that we unconsciously defend our self-concept. So this is about your belief. So if a habit threatens who you think you are, you're going to abandon that habit to preserve your identity. Another thing is stress reveals identity, not intention. So dads, we typically don't yell on our best days, but we yell when we're tired, late, or overwhelmed. In those moments, identity takes over, not our goals. Okay. And then lasting change comes from becoming, not forcing. So when you start to act as if the kind of man and father that you believe you're becoming, habits will follow naturally instead of feeling like constant self control. And so, this is to me really important to understand as a dad because I for a long time was working on willpower and I was having my identity based on like I'm not going to be doing this. But when I began to shift and I began to focus on the father who I was becoming, I actually saw this change become much more rapid and much more ingrained in how I showed up on a daily and much more consistent basis. So I want to share the research behind it because I didn't know that research at the time, but I was actually doing it. And I want you to have an example of, wow, when you make this shift, it actually works. So over to you, Dan.
Yeah, I just want to also share some examples of new identity statements that dads can choose. Number one, I'm a calm and present father. Here's another one. I lead my home with emotional strength. And then finally, I repair when I fail. And an insight with in this area, you can just say to yourself, or I'm just saying to the dads out there, you don't need to be a perfect example. You need a clear identity. So let's go to our final section here, practical application. What's one simple identity exercise that you use, Drew?
Yeah, so this was part of that process that I began going through, and I still have it to this day on my phone in my daily reminders. And what it is it's a series of statements about myself, about the type of father I am. And so that's how I chose to, I guess, bring this about. And I didn't realize it was grounded in this research. And I just had statements like, I'm a kind, patient, and self disciplined father. I forgive. I have principles, and I'm very respectful and resilient. I unconditionally love my children. And anyways, it goes on. It's much longer than that. And I have four areas, we'll say, that I focused on these simple statements of here's who I am. And I had it as a reminder on my phone. It would pop up in the morning, it would pop up in the evening. So it would start, that's how I'd start my day, and that's how I'd end my day. And so for me, the phone was relevant because it was automated essentially. The reminders would just simply pop up, and I'd have no choice but to see it. So it was one way, and even if I didn't necessarily read it or speak it out, it was there constantly reminding me of who I am, or you could say who I was becoming. And so I think whatever works for you as a listener that's going to refresh or remind you and come up with a statement that is from your heart or from your vision or your goals of the father you want to be, then you'll begin to make this change because it's ever present for you. So that to me, that was powerful and important. As I said, it's still there on my phone today, reminding me.
Love that. That's fantastic. So, as we recap today, we talked about three areas: the problem, inherited patterns. We also talked about the reframe, choosing a new identity. And then finally, practical application. And Drew gave a really nice one that he's been using for a while. Some takeaways. You can honor where you came from without being trapped by it. I want to say that again. You can honor where you came from without being trapped by it. Also, identity change creates sustainable behavior change. Also, father transformation starts with intentional choice, not perfection. And then every moment is an opportunity to choose a new legacy. I want to say some encouragement, reinforce, change is possible starting right now. And also to dads, the legacy is built one decision at a time. And I want to challenge you to be the leader in your home. So as we wrap up here, a few quick things. As always, you are watching or listening to Dad Central, a parenting podcast to reduce stress and build confidence in fatherhood. Our show is sponsored by Dove Men Plus Care. Dove Men Plus Care believes that care is the best of men. When men care for themselves and others, there is a positive impact. And then finally, we want you to send in questions so we can answer them during our shows. So please feel free to email your questions to podcast@dadcentral.ca, and Drew and myself will do our absolute best to answer them. We're not perfect, but we will do the best we can to answer your questions. So as always, want to say thank you so much for giving the most valuable thing in your life, your time, to listening or watching us. As always, don't just manage your time, manage energy. And Drew has one more thing he wants to share.
Yeah, I think it's important to mention to dads, this change, especially wanting to break the cycle, is not a lone wolf type of change. And while I'm sharing examples of what maybe I've done, the most important thing that I chose to do was to surround myself with other men, other fathers, and that community, those examples, their stories is really what helped, I'd say, accelerate or even enable some of the things that I was doing to begin shifting. And so I want you to know, obviously, if you're listening to the show, I'm glad that you've chosen to listen, and that I hope you feel like we're coming alongside you in your journey. And I want you to know that that's great, but there are also the importance of having an actual community or others around. And so that activity that I came from actually going to a retreat and connecting with other men, and that I was like, you know what, this is my takeaway. And so there's so much value and power in connecting with other men and dads. And I just want to encourage you, if you don't have at least one other dad that you can connect with, I want to encourage you to find one. And of course, we have our dad mentor community. So if you're looking for support, there are opportunities out there.
Great way to end off. The only thing I would add onto that is just work on getting a little bit better each day. This is a journey. It's a journey, and celebrate those small wins. So thanks so much, and we'll catch you soon. Thank you.